I want to welcome you all to the second session, Income and Earnings of the 2024 SIPP Conference. My name is Sandy Dietrich. I am the Survey Improvement Research Branch Chief here at the Census Bureau. I will be the chair for this session. Just a couple reminders. Each presenter will have about 30 minutes to present. And presenters, I will give you, I'll let you know when we have about a couple minutes left to your presentation. Questions and discussions will be left to the end of the session, so after everyone has presented. Other than that, I will proceed to the first presenter. Here we have Karen Smith, who will be presenting about DynaSim microsimulation model. Karen is a senior fellow in the Income and Benefits Policy Center at the Urban Institute. Over the past 40 years, she has developed microsimulation models for evaluating Social Security, pensions, taxation, wealth and savings, labor supply, charitable giving, health expenditure, student aid, and welfare reform. She has also played a lead role in the development of the Social Security Administration's modeling income in the near-term microsimulation model and the policy simulation model, as well as with the Urban's dynamic simulation of income microsimulation model. So with that, I will turn it over to Karen. Thank you, Karen.
Can you see my screen? Can you see my screen?
Yes, we do.
We're all good. You can proceed.
Okay, great. Okay, thanks. Thanks, everybody. So just a quick outline of my talk. I'm going to start with a little bit of background, describe the history of DynaSim, a little bit more about how the DynaSim model works or what it does, present to you one of the sort of main challenges I have with the model, describe the methods for dealing with those challenges, show you some results, and then end with some conclusions. So as background, DynaSim is a dynamic microsimulation model. It's designed to simulate the U.S. population characteristics, income, and assets from 2006 to the year 2100. Its primary purpose is to estimate and evaluate Social Security reform options, but it has other applications too. You can look at health, pensions, wealth. There's lots of things you can use the model for. It's a distributional model, allows analysis of winners and losers from various reforms, and it shows results for key subgroups. These include age, cohort, disability, education, gender, marital status, race, income, work histories. Importantly, it captures a lot of interaction. So if you increase Social Security, it would have effect on poverty, have effect on SSI. So it captures those interactions. DynaSim has a very long history at the Urban Institute. It was started in the 1970s by Guy Orchid. He's one of the pioneers of microsimulation as a method for doing this type of analysis. Then in 1990, DynaSim 2 was developed. This was the version of DynaSim that was used for the 1983 Social Security reforms. Then in DynaSim 3 was started in 1998. That's when I joined the Urban Institute. At that point, we updated the starting sample, updated most of the demographic and economic functions. The development of DynaSim really coincided with the development of the modeling income in the near term and polysim models for the Social Security Administration. And this work led to a lot of synergies, including many of the components that are in the MINT model were directly ported into DynaSim. We also had access to administrative earnings that we wouldn't have absent those Social Security Administration contracts. Then DynaSim 4 was started in 2017. Again, we updated the starting sample. Now this sample is based on the 2004-2008 SIPP panel, and Dynasim 4 is the current version of Dynasim. We updated several demographic functions, but basically over time we've just developed and updated the model. So Dynasim projects birth, schooling, home leaving, marriage and divorce, immigration, emigration, internal migration. It projects health status, work limitations, personal care needs, disability take-up, health and death, earnings. The earnings are done using 3 separate components. There's labor force participation, hours worked, and hourly wage. And the product of those 3 components gives annual earnings. It calculates pension coverage and pension type, calculates financial assets and home equity, retirement and benefit take-up. It also calculates pension benefit income, Social Security income, SSI, asset income, income from other family members, so I can get to family income, calculates taxes, so payroll taxes, federal and state income taxes, Medicare surtaxes, calculates total income both before and after tax, calculates poverty status, health insurance coverage, use and cost for long-term services and supports, total and out-of-pocket medical spending. One of the most important things it does is it calculates Social Security benefits. So Social Security benefits are calculated on the basis of the average of your top 35 years of wage indexed earnings. So Dynasim needs to have the worker's earnings before the SIPP interview in order to calculate those Social Security benefits. So the main challenge I have is when I'm using the SIPP, I really need to have lifetime earnings. So part of the synergies that I had when developing the Mint model is that I did have access to the SIPP data linked with the SIPP data linked to the Social Security Administration data. So that's earnings data and benefits data. But that data is not available to Dynasim because Dynasim is it uses all public use information, and the SSA models are only for in-house certified users. But the Mint model starts with an exact match of the SIPP data linked to the Social Security Administration earnings and benefit data. And then I can use this exact match data basically to validate what I'm doing in Dynasim. So what I really want is longitudinal earnings. So my goal is to impute these longitudinal earnings for all individuals on the SIPP before the SIPP interview date. To do this, I'm going to use 4 different data sources: the Panel Study of Income Dynamics, National Longitudinal Survey of Youth, a Public Use Summary Earnings Record, Public Use Master Beneficiary Record, though that Master Beneficiary Record has longitudinal earnings on it. So what is the PSID? The PSID is a longitudinal household survey started in 1968. It has annual data from 1968 to 1999, and then every other year after 1999, the survey is ongoing. It collects data for household heads and spouses. It includes 2 immigrant refresher samples. Unfortunately, it's not well representative for young people because they don't collect information unless you're a head or a spouse. But from the original 4,800 families, because they're following those individuals over time, by 2013, the sample includes 75,000 individuals. The NLSY starts with 9,000 individuals. They're age 12 to 16 in December of 1996. I have longitudinal data for them through 2006. It has annual interviews from 1997 to 2010. Like the PSID, it switched to every other year starting in 2010. And the Social Security Administration released a public use summary earnings record. This is a 1% sample of Social Security numbers issued before January 1st, 2007. It's got over 4 million individuals on it. It contains Social Security covered earnings from 1951 to 2006. But the only demographic information on that file is sex and birth year. The public use master beneficiary record linked to the earnings record, it's a 1% sample of Social Security beneficiaries in December of 2001 and has over 400,000 observations. It contains monthly benefit amount, current entitlement, and type of benefits. Importantly, though, associated with the benefit amount and benefit type, I have the longitudinal earnings records that generated that benefit amount. But like the SER, the only demographic information I have is sex and birth year. So kind of laying out the schematic of what I have, I've got the 4 data sets, the SIPP, ETLSY, PSID, and the SER. I have in the single cross section of 2006, I have kind of starting data. And then I'm actually going to do 2 passes of the data to do this imputation, but I'm going to use the early parts of the PSID to inform a second round match to get the earnings back to 1951. So what is the method? I'm going to use a weighted distance function. The weighted distance function is going to go through every individual on the SIPP file age 15 and older and find the record that has the best or the minimum distance compared with the donor file. So I have X characteristics on my donor file. So this is the SIPP, this is the NLSY or the PSID data minus the X characteristic on the SIPP file. I divide that by the standard deviation. That just standardizes it for the amount of variance. I square it. So this is very similar to what an ordinary least squares regression is going to do. The second piece of this is a weight. And the weight says the things that matter in doing the predictions are the ones that I really no match on. I'm willing to give a little on the things that matter less. So I really need to think of a way to come up with how to calculate these weights. So my variable of interest really is the lifetime earnings. That's what I'm trying to impute. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to estimate an OLS stepwise regression with total earnings as the dependent variable, and I'm going to include a whole bunch of X variables. These include current earnings, annual hours, pension income, Social Security income, SSI, financial assets, age, family size, disability status, age last worked. I can put lots and lots of things in that statistical match. And then I run separate regressions by sex and broad age groups. And the stepwise regression generates partial R squares for each of the X variables. And then I use this partial R square to generate the weights in the statistical match. So how did it work? So this figure compares the average index lifetime earnings by birth cohort. So I have birth cohort along the x-axis. The top 2 bars are results for men. The bottom 2 bars are results for women. The blue bars are the imputed values. So this is what I backcasted or statistically matched from my donor files. And the orange bars are what I get from the exact match SIPP SER data. And so what is my main takeaway? The results look very good. One thing to point out is that the blue bars for men are always a little bit higher than the orange bars for men for the actual. That's partly because I am projecting total earnings and not just Social Security covered earnings. The main difference is that there are people who are in uncovered Social Security jobs who have zeros in their earnings records, and then the covered earnings only have values up to the taxable maximum. So I'm actually projecting total earnings, not just covered earnings. So these are the numbers for men and women. That's the median. Again, same results, very close. 25th percentile, you're seeing so I'm capturing the distribution of the earnings. That's 26th percentile. There's the 76th percentile. So I'm getting the median, the mean, the 75th percentile. This is the standard deviation. I do see a slight increase in the standard deviation starting for about the 1945 birth cohort. I think this kind of reflects rising inequality of earnings, especially for men. This is the average number of work years. The funny shape of this is because for people born in 1960, they haven't had many years of work before 2006. And for the people born in 1905, the lifetime earnings are sensitive that only start in 1951, so it's getting chopped off at the beginning. But basically, you can see I'm capturing the number of work years quite well. I can look at numbers by race. So this is looking at men. These are whites. These are non-whites. These are women again by race. Projections for white women, projections for non-white women, again very close. You can look at the numbers by education. I'm capturing those differentials by education. This is for women by education. So my takeaway is I think I've done a very good job at predicting these lifetime earnings, but a really, really important byproduct of this method is that it allows me to calculate individual specific error terms. So I can calculate, because I have a longitudinal earnings, I can now calculate for these longitudinal earnings both a permanent and transitory error. And these error terms are critically important for projecting labor force participation, hours worked, hourly wage, home equity, and financial assets. But I use a SIPP for other things than just the backcast. I use the SIPP for the marriage. I use the marriage history topical module that provides the start and ending dates for current and prior marriages. This is critically important for determining Social Security benefits. I can use the fertility history topical module that provides the number of children ever born and the birth years for the first and last child. That's very important, especially for calculating female labor force participation and earnings. I also have migration history and immigration dates, the source region, and immigrant status. This is really important for understanding when I should expect the first year of earnings, benefit eligibility, and covered earnings. SIPP also provides critical information about starting family composition, starting income, home ownership, and assets, starting pension coverage, pension type, and job tenure. The SIPP is also a really important source for a variety of behavioral estimates, including pension coverage and contributions, disability, means and non-means tested benefits. There's more that I haven't listed. So in conclusion, the SIPP is just critical source, data source for DynaSim. It's the basis for the starting sample. It allows me to calculate behavioral changes from a very rich starting source. I use both the core and the topical module data to inform both the backcast and the future projections. One real challenge I have is with the most recent SIPP panel, some of the content has been lost. Specifically, there was information in the SSA supplement that's been dropped. That includes important information about marriage histories and pension information. The loss of that data is problematic for me in future updates to DynaSim. And since we're starting with the 2004-2006 panels, as the time goes by, those begin to look more and more dated. So I'm trying to think about alternative sources. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. Very nice and very interesting. Good job. So we will now turn it over to our second presenter. We have Jose Mustre del Rio, who will be presenting on Ask an Economist, Lifetime Earnings, differences across Black and white individuals. Jose is a research and policy officer at the Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City. His main areas of research are in microeconomics, labor economics, consumer finance, and computational economics. Thank you, Jose, for being here. The floor is all yours.
Great. Thank you very much, Sandy, for the introduction. And thank you very much for the invitation to come present. I've learned a lot today about the SIPP and about many other things. So as just mentioned, this is work with my colleague, Andy Glover, and Emily, who's here. And it's about lifetime earnings differences between Black and white workers. So since we work at the Federal Reserve, I should just note that the usual disclaimer, these are our own views and not those of our bank or the Federal Reserve System or the Board of Governors. Now, because we're using some really amazing SIPP data, I also have to give another not disclaimer, just a highlight that this was this research was performed using the synthetic SIPP data housed on the Cornell University server with the following grant. I'll just give you a second to read this. And I'm actually going to try to come back to this towards the end. Anyway, moving along. Okay, so what was our motivation here is if you think about research on differences in earnings between Black and white workers, typically that research, mainly for data constraint reasons, focuses on differences at a point in time. So for example, differences in average hourly earnings or maybe annual salaries, always at a point in time, either say over the course of a month or over a year. So to give you an example, this is data from Wilson and Rogers. They basically took reported average hourly earnings from the CPS outgoing rotation surveys, and then just looked at average hourly earnings for Black and white workers, broke it down between men and women, and computed the gap in those earnings between, for example, Black male workers relative to white male workers, and similarly for women. And you can see here a couple of things. So this gap has been gradually increasing since the early 80s. Right now for men, on average, Black males earn about 30% less than what similar white males earn. The gap is a bit lower, but still exists for women. It's about 17% now. But again, the key highlight is this is just a snapshot at a point in time, and it tells you something about their average hourly earnings. This could understate labor market inequality for a number of reasons. One of them is just simply if you think of lifetime employment or labor force attachment differing across individuals or groups of individuals. And there's good reason to believe that's the case. So, for example, this is just as motivation. That's something we actually touch with our data, but you can think about looking at differences in unemployment rates across Black and white workers. So here I'm plotting in blue the unemployment rate for Black workers, in green the unemployment rate for white workers, and in orange that's just the difference between the two. And you can see pretty clearly there's a systematic gap. It's cyclical, so it goes up in recessions, comes down in expansions, but it never closes to zero. So for example, just prior to the pandemic, there was a lot of discussion about how the hot labor market really was benefiting in reducing gaps in unemployment between Black and white workers. And yes, you can see the gap reached about 2 percentage points. It's never been as low until recently. The other thing is, okay, unemployment rate is also a bit of a snapshot in time. It's just asking whether you're working or not, and searching for a job or not today or within this month. The other thing, and I find this pretty interesting, is that conditional on being unemployed, median duration, so how long you stay unemployed, is also longer among Black workers relative to white workers. And this shows exactly that. So again, here I'm just plotting median duration. I took a 6-month moving average because it's a little noisy. In weeks, in the blue for Black workers, in the green for white workers, and the orange line here is the gap. So again, you can see here, there's always a bit of a gap. Sometimes it approaches 0, but typically it's around 3 weeks, which is about what we see as of late. So again, on average, 3 weeks longer of a difference in median duration of unemployment. So that's just building up the point that to the extent that there are differences in lifetime employment across groups, those will probably translate into differences in lifetime earnings, like the point Karen was just highlighting. And thus looking at lifetime earnings is probably going to provide a more accurate picture of labor market inequality. Okay, so hopefully I've motivated to you why we should look at lifetime earnings. The question is, how can we do that? And I think Karen really nicely set up the stage for me. So we're going to leverage the synthetic SIPP data, and I'll discuss a little bit more of it in a second, but I'm far from the expert. I'd rather our hosts tell us more about it. And what we're going to do is we're going to examine lifetime earnings differences between Black and white workers. In short, the reason why we're going to be able to do that is a synthetic SIPP is basically a synthesized version of the gold standard files that are going to have actual SIPP responses combined with W-2 earnings records. And that combination, that intersection of the data is really going to help us talk about things that typically we can't observe or talk about when we only look at admin data, which is going to give us the detailed earnings, or when we only look at survey data where we can talk about narrowly defined demographics, but maybe don't have as much confidence in their earnings. And importantly, it's going to be very longitudinal. So we're going to take a stance that a lifetime here is going to be about 30 years of earnings data from which we can observe. So we're going to leverage that data, and then we're going to do some very simple analysis. We're going to do a shift share analysis to decompose the sources of lifetime earning inequality between Black and white workers. And we're going to decompose that into 2 natural things. One is you could think about differences in average earnings per year worked. So you can think about the average salary a Black worker and a similar white worker earn. How big is that gap and how much that contributes to the total gap in lifetime earnings? The other thing is, as I was previously alluding to, is we can look at differences in years worked. So you could think of that as differences in labor market attachment or career length. We don't take a stance on what it is, we just measure years worked. So what do we find? So as you might expect, we do find differences in lifetime earnings between Black and white workers that are indeed larger than point-in-time estimates. And this is particularly true when we look at amongst men. So for just to give you some numbers, and then I'll go into greater detail, our results suggest that lifetime earnings gaps between Black and white workers are between 42 and 14%, depending if you look at men or women. So men, it's about 42% men to men, Black men to white men, whereas women, it's about 14%. And just by comparison, this is just basically taking the numbers I just showed you a few graphs ago. The average hourly earnings differences that you would get at a point in time are about 27 to 17%. So this does give credence to this idea that, either these point in time measures really understate to some extent differences in earnings inequality that accrue over an entire career or lifetime. And we can tell you a bit more. So with the shift share analysis, we're going to be able to argue that both components of what I just laid out, career length, years worked, and earnings per year matter. And they matter in different ways depending on who you look at. So one of the things we're going to be able to look at, like as I said, is differences across men and women. So if you focus on women alone, most of the differences in lifetime earnings between Black and white women are explained by differences in earnings per year. So you can think of it as the salary difference as being the main driver of that gap. For men, we find that lifetime employment or years worked starts playing more of a role. So their differences in years worked account for about 30% of this gap, and it's going to vary. And by vary, let me give you a couple of examples that we just thought were very interesting. So some gaps actually go in the other direction. By that, I mean the gap between Black individuals and similar white individuals is opposite in that Black individuals actually earn more. A case of that is if you look at college-educated Black women tend to earn a bit more than similarly educated white women. There we find the reason for that is not so much that Black women actually earn more per year, but rather they work a few more years. And that actually helps offset differences in earnings per year and lead to a gap in the opposite direction. Pushing more on this notion of differences in years worked, we find that that's extremely noticeable when you look at Black men with without a high school degree. So they have lower lifetime earnings than their white counterparts, and there we can explain the majority, more than 50% of the gap, purely by looking at differences in years worked. So there, the gap in years worked is about 5.5, pushing 6 years of fewer years worked compared to similarly educated white men. Okay, so that's just a preview of the findings. Let me just give you a quick roadmap of what we'll do. I'm going to talk to you just a little bit about the data and how we constructed it. But then I want to focus on our results and then quickly conclude. Okay. So as I mentioned, we use data from the census's SIPP synthetic beta. So hopefully I've convinced you early in the introduction that this really just combines the relative strengths and takes away the weaknesses of using administrative data coming from the SSA IRS records with survey-based data. So on the one hand, with the admin-based data, we're going to be able to look at potentially entire lifetime earnings histories. So for our analysis, what we're going to do is we look at individuals who in the late 70s, early 80s were about 18 to 25, so are entering the labor market, and we're going to follow them as long as we can, which is in our case through 2014. So by then they're in their mid 50s, early 60s, and that's what we're going to think of as an entire lifetime or career. Basically, we're going to aggregate all their earnings covered by Social Security and convert those into real terms using CPI and just be able to come up for each individual a measure of lifetime earnings. Now, Karen really nicely lined this up for me. If we just looked at sources like the public use SSA data, we would have information on age and sex, but we wouldn't have information on race or education. And that's where the survey data component, the SIPP component of this data set really comes in handy because we can observe that, or we measure that. So in our case, race is going to be coded as Black or white because we have no information on ethnicity. Sex is male or female. And then we're going to categorize individuals based on years of education as having less than a high school diploma, some college, and then we're going to group together college or more. Okay, so with that in mind, let's just jump into the results. So a lot of the tables are going to look like this. I'll spend a little bit more time on this one explaining each column, and then hopefully that'll set us up to kind of breeze through the rest. So, okay, we have these measures of lifetime earnings for Black and white workers. Keep in mind, these are lifetime earnings, so the scale is going to be big. So to make things easy to interpret, the numbers here are quoted in thousands of dollars. So based on our calculations, we find that Black workers in our sample on average earn about $1.1 million over the course of their lifetimes, which compares to about 1.6 with white workers in our sample. So that leads to a gap of about $500,000, or in percentage terms, that's a gap of about 34%. Okay, so then the next thing what we just to remind you, so that gap in 34%, the one way you could compare it to, and this is why we argue that the lifetime's earning gap is bigger and therefore earnings inequality is understated by point in time measures, is again, remember how I mentioned previously that the average hourly earnings gap between Black and white workers is about 20% over a very similar time period. So we get an additional 14 percentage points of earnings inequality, if you will, by looking at entire lifetime earnings. So the next thing we can do is then, how can we decompose between differences in years worked versus differences in earnings per year, this gap? If you look at differences in years worked and just look overall between Black and white workers, the difference in years worked isn't that big. It's about 2 years worked, or a difference of 8 percentage points between the two. Really, the big contributor amongst these two is differences in earnings per year. So whereas the average earnings per year among Black workers is around $42,000 per year worked, it's closer to $58,000 per year worked amongst white workers, leading to a gap of about $16,000 per year, or in percentage terms, 28%. So there's a lot of numbers here. I wanted to try to give you kind of a bit more of a flavor of what this looks like graphically. So what this bar chart does is basically takes that gap of $500,000 and says how much of it is it explained by differences in years worked, which I told you are about 2.3, and how much is it due to differences in earnings per year, doing that, which I said is about 16,000, basically doing the shift share analysis. So you can see here that disproportionately, the majority of this gap, when you look overall across Black and white workers, is due to this green area, which is differences in earnings per year. The remainder is accounted either just by differences in years worked, or just recall, because this is a shift share analysis, the combination of the two, both differences in years worked and earnings per year. So here, that headline argument is, if you take a step back and think, if I only looked at point in time measures, that would mostly be capturing something like this green bar, to the extent that you can think of the green bar as like an annual salary that you could look at in the cross section. What you would be missing by not looking at entire lifetime earnings is this blue and orange bars that are the difference in years worked and the interaction between years worked and earnings per year. Another way of putting this in perspective, and I'm only going to show you one or two graphs like this, is thinking about this in dollar terms. So here I'm basically doing the exact same thing of what I did in the previous graph, but just building it up in dollar terms. So the blue bar here is just our estimate of average lifetime earnings amongst Black workers, which I said is close to $1.1 million. And on the far right, in the yellow bar, it's the estimate of lifetime earnings among white workers, which is around $1.6 million. So how can you get from the blue bar to the yellow bar? Well, one, you could take the average earnings per year among Black workers, but then assign to them the years worked that of similar white individuals. If you do that counterfactual, you would get this green bar, suggesting that in that alternative scenario, Black workers' lifetime earnings would increase to about $1.2 million, so about $100,000 more. Alternatively, you could keep the years worked of Black workers as we observe in the data, and instead assign them the average earnings per year the white individuals that we estimate for white individuals. If you do that alternative calculation, you get this orange bar, which would imply that Black workers in that scenario would earn about $1.5 million in terms of lifetime earnings, closing most of the gap relative to white workers. So that's why we say that the punchline here is you would get about an additional $400,000 in terms of lifetime earnings if you close this earnings per year gap between Black and white workers. So now the next question is, this is very still pretty aggregated. We're looking at all Black individuals and all white individuals, the first next step is you could look by sex. So this table replicates what I just showed you for all individuals, but looks specifically at women. So focusing here on the bottom, here I just want to highlight that the gaps are smaller once you look at women. So the gap between Black and white women is about 14 percentage points, or about $150,000 in terms of lifetime earnings. The gap in years worked is less than a year, so only about 1 percentage point difference between the two. And really, it's mostly coming from differences in earnings per year, which are about 13% or about $6,000 per year. And just remember that for the overall, I previously mentioned numbers of 34, 8, and 28% for this row. So in general, once you focus on women, gaps are smaller, and they're mostly related to earnings per year rather than years worked. By contrast, for men, it does look a bit different. In particular, all these gaps look bigger. Focusing on this number, you can see that the gap in lifetime earnings between Black men and white men is about 42%, or close to $900,000 in terms of lifetime earnings. A chunk of that can be explained by years worked. On average, Black men work about 4 years less than their white male counterparts, or about 13 percentage points less. There's still a sizable gap in earnings per year of about $23,000 per year, or 33%. So all these numbers are larger than on average. So looking by sex is going to affect how you interpret these numbers. We can go a step, going back to these decompositions of the gap in terms of earnings per year and years worked, we can see that for women, the bulk of the story really has to do with differences in earnings per year. So again, normalizing that gap within women to be 100%, most of it is explained by the green bar, which is differences in earnings per year between Black and white women. The green bar is still the largest contributor among when looking at men, but there's a greater prevalence or importance of differences in years worked, as you can see here in the far right, by looking at the size of this blue bar and the interaction of years worked and earnings per year. Okay. So again, though, looking at all just men or all just women is going to mask some differences by education, which is another thing that we can tackle with in the synthetic SIPP data. Okay, so let's break it down by education between the 4 education groups, and let's focus on women. Here's where we find one of the things that really caught our attention when we were performing this analysis is the gap actually flips when you look at college-educated women. So focusing on this 4th row, you can see that the gap in lifetime earnings is actually negative between Black and white women. So in other words, saying that Black women earn around $27,000 more in terms of lifetime earnings relative to similarly educated white women. And that is both related due to differences in years worked and earnings per year, but these things actually go in opposite directions. So Black college-educated women work nearly 3 years more than similarly educated white women, though they earn about $4,000 per year less than similarly educated white women. So on net, that translates into a gap tilting in towards Black college-educated women. In percentage terms, the differences aren't that big. You could think of it as this is close to 0, but slightly negative. 1.6 percentage terms higher lifetime earnings for college-educated Black women relative to white women. And again, here, as I was saying, big offsetting effects between differences in years worked versus earnings per year. You can see that here very clearly where we actually had to plot the bars for college-educated women and another axis here on the far right. And all this is just highlighting is the impact of years worked, greater years worked among college educated Black women, more than offsetting a negative difference in earnings per year, earning less per year, so that you end up with a slightly positive, slightly negative gap. The story looks a bit different for the remaining educational categories, where again here, much like with the overall breakdowns among women, the driving force for this difference really is in terms of earnings per year or annual salary. We can do the same and look among men. Here, there are a couple of interesting stories. First, the big one is, as previewed by the results looking overall at men, these gaps are big. So if you focus on college-educated males, college-educated Black males on average earn about $1.4 million less over the course of an entire lifetime, or about 41% less relative to college-educated white males. And that's due both to, in part, a gap in years worked of about 3 years, but really a large gap in terms of earnings per year of about $40,000, or about 36%. One thing that doesn't immediately stand out here from these numbers that looks much clearer when you look at these bar charts is that the importance of years worked really depends, particularly among men, really depends on what educational group you're looking at. So as I previously highlighted, if you look at college degree or more educated men, most of the difference in lifetime earnings between Black and white workers is attributable to differences in earnings per year. But if you go to the far left of this graph, you can see that amongst those with less than a high school degree, the majority of the gap is explained by differences in years worked. So if you take the combination of this blue bar, which is what we attribute purely to differences in years worked, and the interaction of differences in years worked with differences in earnings per year, this orange bar, you'd end up with about 60% of the gap between those workers explained by differences in by employment differences. And again, just to take a step back, the blue and orange bars are something that you wouldn't be able to capture by looking solely at measures of a point in time. So overall, the fact that there's more than one color here in these bars highlights the importance of being able to measure lifetime earnings over a long period of time. So I think I can wrap up here and move on to questions. Hopefully I've convinced you that looking at point in time measures alone is going to understate earnings inequality between Black and white workers. What we find is that if you look over what we call an entire lifespan, Black workers earn on average 34% less than similar white workers. We also find that both differences in years worked and earnings per year matter, but it's really the degree to which those things matter is going to depend on sex and education. This latter point really highlights, if you want to start thinking about policies, how policies aimed at stimulating employment or labor market attachment could begin making some headway on these differences in lifetime earnings. And then lastly, I just want to make a plea to please bring back the synthetic data. Just a little bit of a history lesson. I started as a very, I think, heavy user of the public use SIPP data. At some point, I started working on getting a proposal into the one of the research, RDCs. And then years ago, I discovered this wonderful thing, which is the synthetic SIPP. It gives me a lot of what I want at a much lower entry point, and I've been able to run with it. So we'd love it back. And with that, that's all I have to say for today, but I'm looking forward to any of your questions or comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Jose. That was a very interesting presentation. Yes, and thank you both Karen as well, Karen and Jose, for joining us today and presenting on your research. I think now we will open it up to questions and comments. Please, for the audience, if you guys just want to raise your hand, that way we can unmute you, or you can type your question in the chat box and I will read it out loud. So are there any questions?
Can I ask Jose a question?
Please.
What age ranges are included in your analysis?
So, I think I went through that a little too fast. So we start with individuals who were between 18 and 25 in 1978, which is, I think, the earliest from which we have records with the synthetic SIPP. And then we follow them through 2014, this same group of people. So that by then they're 54 to 61-ish. So yeah, really the way to think about it, it's a specific like birth cohort. Yeah, because we're looking at entire earnings. But thanks for that clarification.
And one quick thing I would add about the earnings data, we're starting using in 1978 because that's when you can get FICA and non-FICA earnings, but they actually have data on only FICA earnings back to 1951. So if you're interested in that, you can get farther back in time.
I'm sorry, so your analysis only looks at the lifetime earnings beginning in 1978?
Yes.
Okay. No, because I have generating the same answers out of Dynasem, and I'm thinking, what is my ratio? And so my numbers include the earnings without the FICA, or the comparisons.
Great. And also, I just want to chime in, Jose, on the very last part of your presentation. Yes, the SSB, the synthetic SIPP data. We are working on making it available to the public. We're constantly exploring different options. We're talking about it on a weekly basis, where we're at, and I'm hoping that it will be available soon. Again, we're finding just the best environment for the data and making sure that it's easily accessible.
Yeah, no, it's a wonderful tool. I mean, I love the SIPP. The SIPP is actually not, I think, not too hard to manipulate. After a while, there's obviously a learning curve, but the synthetic SIPP is a lot easier. And the fact that we have this essentially admin component of the data is wonderful. And just to make a humble plug, the Kansas City Fed actually has an RDC. So if you need physical space, we might have it. And I'd love to have access to the data, even though it's all remote. I would be happy to go downstairs.
Yes, we have looked into the FSRDC too as a resource. So we are exploring it.
Wonderful.
I can assure you that.
Music to my ears. Thank you so much.
Let me see. Do we have any questions, comments? Jason.
Yeah. Hi. Hopefully the microphone is working a little bit better now. So I have a question for both of you, actually. As and you will hear more about this later this afternoon, but as we're thinking about what is included in new SIPP, as we think about what its future is, going to multi-mode, just to give you a quick highlight of where we're going. My question to you would be, I guess, if we were to think about putting in some modeled summary value for lifetime earnings, or something like, I don't know, what would you want to see, knowing that we couldn't put out, the actual link data, but if we did something with an auxiliary hybrid kind of data source and modeled something, is there a best variable, a best construct that you want? You mentioned years work, you mentioned lifetime earnings, you mentioned some idea about the statistical properties of those.
So, I mean, the things that I'd like to know is how many years you've worked since, say, age 16 or age 20. Age 20 is probably a fine measure. You could also ask, particularly for women, did they take time out of the labor force to have children when they were caring for children or caring for other family members? So those are two things. The other thing that, because we're trying to calculate Social Security benefits, I care a lot about Social Security coverage. And especially in the historic period, there are a lot of jobs where if you worked for the federal government, for example, a lot of state and local government workers work in uncovered employment. I'd like to know if a particular job was uncovered. So like how many years did you work and how many of those are covered? Those would be
Right.
fantastic. The other thing that I'd really love to have that's not on the current SIP, the SIP does ask about fertility history, but the age category that they stop asking that it's like they don't ask for the oldest cohort of women, and those older women are more likely to have taken time out of the labor force for children. So I don't know how many kids they have. So there's like this hole that I'd love to have filled. So that's my wish list.
Okay. Jose, any thoughts about what would make things easy?
So I would echo what Karen just said in terms of years worked, lifetime earnings, any gaps in employment, especially for women, but I think also for men, just because that gives a more complete picture. I think more generally, I really like the layout of the synthetic SIP because so right now, the reason why we focus on lifetime earnings is because it's like a very simple one number we can look at and compare across individuals. But down the road, once we get the synthetic SIP back, what I would love to see is be able to back out basically income fluctuations over time to understand, are these changes, this kind of goes a little bit to Karen's estimation of the errors. Are these changes just transitory or are they more persistent across individuals? So that's why having the entire history is extremely useful. And I guess the one thing, if I could ask for more, and because we're economists, we always want more. So one thing that would be great is to have more summary variables or maybe even slightly disaggregated variables of the SIP inside the synthetic SIP. So because the way the synthetic SIP works right now, it's like a point in time when we interviewed you originally, you were of this kind of education, this kind of marital status, assets and stuff. If you could give us a little bit more of the time window under which you were actually in the SIP, that would be wonderful. So like, for example, if we could have the wealth measures, every year or so that you were in the SIP in combination with the earnings history, that would be amazing. I cannot tell you how excited I would be about that because you can really start thinking about these issues of savings, spending under some assumptions, etc., that can't really be done as well as I think they could be done in the SIP as they are elsewhere. So that would be amazing, but maybe I'm asking for too much.
Well, I mean, we want to first make sure that we can get the SSB out there. People can start accessing it again.
Yeah.
Just, to reinforce that it is not gone. And we're trying to figure out how to just support it. As you know, validation, it was an important part of SSB. It was all done by hand. And so we're trying to figure out how that looks moving forward. I did want to take a quick second and add for Karen, 2021 and later SIP have the marital history variables that you're looking for. We added them back in cooperation with SSA. So you should have 21, 22, 23 data that you can work with, or 21 and 22, 23. Yeah. So.
What about the pension data? Because that was another thing that was kind of lost.
Yep, marital history, retirement, pensions, and disability.
Oh, that's fantastic.
Contents were added back in combination with SSA. And those are areas where we're really taking a look as to what's What's the important stuff to make sure that we keep as we think about making a shorter internet self-response mode feasible? So we want to prioritize those things which are, in the critical list.
Well, I would say marriage histories are pretty critical because Social Security benefits are paid on basis of family income. And without knowing your marriage history, it's really hard to figure out who'd marry and how long those earnings are going to be used. And I mean, one of the main issues I have is understanding coverage. So if you could ask questions about, was that job covered by Social Security? That would be really, really helpful.
Yeah, and that is, of course, one of the limitations about the lifetime earnings, right? The employment and the earnings have to show up in W-2s, right? And so that is a little bit of a limitation, and I don't know how we get around that with, a modeled number or, any other data product other than asking questions and dealing with misreporting and recall and all of those issues. All right, I'm going to stop. I'm going to hand it back over to Sandy. I don't know if there are more questions in the chat or not.
Still looking, and I don't see any in the chat, but any other questions or comments?
It looks like there's one in the chat for Jose and Emily that Becky's asking if you mentioned you weren't able to use ethnicity, and she's wondering why that is.
So Emily, I think we determined that we couldn't, that there wasn't a variable generated for ethnicity in the SSB. Is that true?
That was my memory of it, but then when I looked at the code book today, there did seem to be a variable for Hispanic or not Hispanic, which confused me. I wonder if it's because when we did the first project, we were using a different version of the SSB and didn't realize that it had been added.
Okay, so that's something we could improve upon. Thank you.
Yes.
Any other questions? Okay, well, I think we're ending a little early, but thank you again, Jose and Karen. That was a fantastic presentation. Yeah, I guess you guys are gonna have a little longer break than expected, but thank you everyone for attending this session. Our next session will start at 2:10.
Can I just interject something I just thought of?
Yeah, we got the time.
Yeah. So I noticed with the 2023 Social Security Statistical Supplement, so this is SSA administrative data, they now have added some reports about earnings and benefits by race. So that was newly added in the 2023 survey. So, and that's administrative data. So you had a chance to see kind of what SSA understands these differentials to be with administrative 100% sample.
Thank you.
And Karen, is that a public use version of that, or are
Well, so it's just published reports. SSA does it every year. It's the statistical supplement. And I use it for validating DynaSim. So every year a new supplement comes out and I say, well, how am I doing? It allows me to look at trends. So I particularly look at the historic data and, see how things are changing over time. And so I was very happy to see with the 2023 release that there was a whole series of tables added by race.
Okay.
Any other comments? Okay. So I'll let you guys go off.